The alarm didn't sound like fear. It sounded like a held breath. Captain Elena Voss stood on the bridge of the Meridian with her palm flat against the cold viewport, watching a wall of light bend where it shouldn't bend. Somewhere out past the reach of every star chart humanity had ever drawn, a line existed that no ship was allowed to cross. Not because of treaty, not because of politics, because every species that had ever tried had simply stopped existing. "Distress signal repeating," said the comms officer, voice tight. "Origin point is past the veil, Captain. Coordinates don't match anything in the registry." Elena didn't answer right away. She was 34 years old, and in the 6 years since Earth had been welcomed, grudgingly, conditionally, into the wider galactic community, she had learned exactly one rule that mattered more than any other. Humans were tolerated, not trusted. Every mistake was proof they weren't ready. Every act of defiance was filed away as evidence of instability. She had already been given one final warning for disobeying orders. The last time she'd broken formation to pull 11 civilians out of a collapsing station the Coalition had written off as unsalvageable. They lived. Her career almost didn't. "Captain." The voice belonged to Kale Rendathis, the Thakari liaison officer assigned to observe her crew, technically for cultural integration, unofficially to make sure the humans didn't do anything reckless. His 4 eyes tracked her with the patient suspicion of someone who had read every report about her and believed none of the flattering parts. Standing Coalition doctrine is unambiguous. No vessel approaches the veil line under any circumstance. That signal is not our concern. "There are people on it," Elena said. "You don't know that. I don't know that there aren't." Kale's mandibles clicked, a gesture she'd learned meant frustration restrained by discipline. "Humans," he said, not unkindly, "have a talent for turning simple orders into moral arguments." Below decks, in a cramped lab overflowing with fragments of pre-coalition stone and untranslated symbols, Dr. Amara Osi wasn't listening to the debate happening 2 floors above her. She was running her fingers along a photographed inscription pulled from a dead moon 8 systems back, one she'd spent 3 years trying to place. The symbols didn't match any known language, living or extinct, but they matched each other, across worlds, across species, across 10,000 years. The same marks kept appearing near the same kind of structure, old, buried, and always facing the veil. She had a theory nobody wanted funded, that the Coalition hadn't built the boundary at all, that something older had built it first and the elder species had simply inherited the fence line and started calling it law. Her console chimed. The distress signal had changed shape, not garbled, not weakening, but folding into a pattern that looked less like a cry for help and more like a heartbeat. She was still staring at it when the ship's gravity shuddered under her feet. On the bridge, Elena had made her decision the way she made all of them. Fast, and without asking permission she knew wouldn't come. "Helm, plot an intercept course. We're crossing." "Captain, I must formally object." "Objection noted." She dropped into the command chair. "Do it anyway." The Meridian pushed forward, past the last marked buoy, past the invisible boundary that every navigational system in the galaxy treated like the edge of the world. For a moment, nothing happened. Elena almost let herself believe it would be that simple, that the veil was only ever a warning sign, not a wall. Then Kale made a sound she had never heard a Thakari make before. She turned in time to see him collapse. Not stumble, not stagger. Collapse, all 4 legs folding at once, mandibles going slack, eyes rolling back. Dead weight hitting the deck like something had reached inside him and switched him off. Across the bridge, the same thing happened in a wave. The Farron navigator slumped over her console mid-sentence. The Voska engineer crumpled against a bulkhead, every non-human crew member dropping in the same 3 seconds, silent and boneless, as if some signal only their bodies could hear had simply told them to stop. "Medical emergency, all decks." Elena was already moving, catching Kale before his head struck the deck plating, fingers pressed to the strange geometry of his throat, searching for a pulse she didn't fully know how to find. It was there, slow, steady, alive, just unconscious. All of them. Every alien on the ship in the same instant, for no reason any sensor could explain. Every human was still standing. Amara reached the bridge at a dead run, breathless, stepping over the body of a technician she'd shared coffee with an hour earlier. What happened? I don't know. Elena's voice was steady in the way it only got when she was holding something back by force. They just dropped, all of them, at once, the second we crossed. And we didn't. No. Amara knelt by Kyle's unconscious form, checking his vitals with the same careful hand she used on 4,000-year-old artifacts. And for the first time since she'd started chasing this mystery across a dozen systems, she felt something colder than curiosity settle into her chest. Elena, this isn't sickness. This isn't a gas, a field, radiation. Nothing on the sensors changed. Something did this on purpose. Something that can reach into a ship and choose exactly who to put down. Choose how? I don't know. But it didn't choose us. The words hung in the recycled air of the bridge, heavier than anything either of them wanted to say next. A new tone rose from the sensor console, not an alarm exactly, but close, insistent, climbing in pitch the way a predator's growl climbs before it commits to the charge. The junior officer, still on his feet, one of only 3 conscious crew members left standing among a dozen collapsed bodies, turned from his station with his face gone the color of old paper. Captain, something's powering up out there big. Define big. Bigger than anything in the registry. It wasn't there 90 seconds ago. He swallowed. It is now. And Captain, it's not drifting. It's moving. Toward us. Elena looked out the viewport, past the edge of the veil line, into the black, where no human eyes had ever legally been allowed to look. For a moment there was nothing but stars. Then one of the stars blinked, and it wasn't a star at all. Something ancient had just opened its eyes, and it was already looking directly at them. Nobody on the bridge breathed until the light stopped moving. For 11 long seconds, the thing on the sensors had surged toward the meridian at a speed nothing in Coalition records could match. Then, just as suddenly, it slowed, hovered at the edge of detection range, and went still. Watching or waiting, or something with no human word attached to it yet. Elena kept her eyes on the viewport, one hand still braced under Cale's unconscious head, and made herself speak in a voice that didn't shake. Status. It's not approaching anymore, the junior officer said. It's just there. Powered down to a fraction of what it was. Almost like it's asleep again. Almost. Yes, Captain. Around the bridge, the collapsed crew began, one by one, to stir. Cale's eyes opened first, unfocused, then sharp with a fear Elena had never seen cross his face before. He pushed himself upright too fast, swayed, and let her steady him without protest, a small thing. But for a Thakari officer who treated physical independence as a matter of professional pride, it told her exactly how frightened he still was. How long was I out? He asked. Under 2 minutes. It felt like longer. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple. I don't remember losing consciousness. One moment I was speaking to you. The next I was on the floor, and there was... He stopped himself. There was what? A sound. Not heard. Felt. Like something counting. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his usual clipped formality cracked into something rawer. Captain, every non-human aboard this ship experienced the same thing, in the same instant. That is not coincidence. That is selection. Amara, still crouched beside the ship's other recovering crew, looked up sharply. Selection based on what? Nobody answered. Nobody could. They found the source 2 hours later, drifting at the edge of long-range sensors, a structure so large that at first the crew mistook it for a moon. It wasn't. It was built, ancient beyond anything catalogued in Coalition archives, its surface a lattice of interlocking spires that seemed to fold away from any angle the eye tried to hold steady on. It was the origin of the distress call. It was also, they soon realized, no longer calling for help. It had simply been transmitting on a loop for what the ship's dating instruments estimated was several thousand years. Elena led the boarding team herself, over Kale's objection, and this time, over her own better judgment too, because leaving anyone behind on a ship half its crew had just watched collapse for no reason didn't sit right with her. Amara came for the science. Kale came, he said flatly, to document the mistake in real time. Inside, the structure was cold in a way no environmental system could explain. Air still breathable, gravity still functioning after millennia of apparent abandonment. Every wall was covered in the same interlocking symbols Amara had spent 3 years chasing across a dozen dead worlds. Here, finally, there was enough of them to almost read. Almost turned out to be the operative word for 6 frustrating hours, until Amara found a chamber near the structure's core where the symbols weren't just carved. They were repeated, over and over, in dozens of distinct scripts, layered atop one another like different hands had come back across centuries to add their own version of the same warning. "I have a partial translation," she said. Voice hushed the way people's voices go hushed in old churches and graveyards. "It's not one message. It's the same message written again and again by people who didn't share a language. Which means whatever wrote it first, whoever built this place, outlived everyone who came after and tried to warn the ones who came next." "What does it say?" Elena asked. Amara read it slowly, translating as she went, choosing her words with the caution of someone diffusing something live. "They do not sleep. They count. When the count is finished, they will come for what was taken." Silence settled over the chamber. "Count what?" Kyle asked. "I don't know yet." Amara's hands had gone still on the console. "But I think this place isn't a ruin. I think it's a beacon. And I think it's been waiting for something specific to walk through that door." She reached out and touched the central inscription, meaning only to steady the recording sensor against the wall. The entire chamber lit up at once, every symbol on every surface ignited with pale blue light in perfect unison, a wave of illumination rushing outward from beneath Amara's fingers and racing up through the spires above them, visible even through the hull plating from outside. Kyle staggered back, weapon half raised at nothing, at everything. Elena grabbed Amara's arm and hauled her back from the wall, but the light didn't fade. If anything, it grew brighter, pulsing now in a rhythm that felt less like a machine and more like something waking up after a very long, very patient sleep. "I didn't do anything," Amara said, staring at her own hand like it belonged to someone else. "I barely touched it." "It wasn't the touch," Kale said slowly, and there was something close to dread in his voice now, something that cut straight through his usual composure. "Look at the pattern. It didn't activate when the ship arrived. It didn't activate when the rest of us walked through this room. It activated when she touched it, specifically her." "Why me?" Nobody had an answer, and out past the hull, on every sensor still functioning on the Meridian, something changed. The dormant gravitational signature that had powered down after its first terrifying surge, the thing that had looked at them like something ancient opening its eyes, flared back to full power in an instant, and this time, it wasn't alone. New signatures bloomed across the sensor grid, one after another, dozens of them, arranged in careful formation like pieces on a board finally being set for the opening move of a very old game. Elena's comms officer's voice cracked through her earpiece, stripped of every ounce of professional calm. "Captain, you need to see this. Whatever's out there, it just woke up its friends. And Captain," a pause, thick with fear, "they're not scattered. They're organized. They're already moving. And they're not heading for the beacon. They're heading straight for us." The first ship didn't fire. It didn't hail. It simply appeared off the Meridian's bow, close enough to fill the viewport, and Elena understood in her gut before any sensor confirmed it that this was not a rescue, and it was not a welcome. "Get everyone back aboard now," she snapped into her comm, already pulling Amara toward the boarding shuttle while Kale covered their retreat with a weapon he clearly didn't expect to need, or to matter. Behind them, the ancient beacon's light was still climbing through its spires, brighter with every second, as if their presence had lit a fuse nobody could see the length of. They made it back to the Meridian with less than 4 minutes to spare before the sky around the beacon filled with ships. They were unlike anything in any coalition database Elena had ever been shown. Long, asymmetrical, built from a matte black material that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect it. They didn't move like vessels with a single pilot or crew navigating by instrument. They moved like something with a single mind, dozens of separate hulls turning in perfect unison, folding into a loose formation with an ease that made Elena's stomach turn. This wasn't a fleet reacting. This was a fleet that had done this before, so many times it had stopped being a decision and become instinct. "They're not firing," the tactical officer reported, voice climbing toward panic despite himself. "No weapons lock, no communication. They're just surrounding us." "Herding," Cale said quietly, and when Elena looked at him, his 4 eyes were fixed on the formation with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Recognition, and beneath it, something close to horror. "You know what this is." "I know what it looks like." He hesitated, and for the first time since she'd met him, Cale Rendathis looked like he was deciding how much of the truth he was contractually allowed to give her. "There are records, very old, very restricted, accessible only to senior coalition liaison officers. Every generation, at least one species petitions to have them declassified. Every generation, the request is denied." "Records of what?" "Of other crossings." His voice dropped. "Humanity is not the first to break the veil line, Captain. You are simply the first to survive long enough to see what happens next." The ships began to close the distance, slow and deliberate, and Elena understood with cold clarity what Cale meant by herding. They weren't attacking. They were shepherding the Meridian deeper into the dark, away from the beacon, away from any hope of retreat back across the line, corralling them the way a predator moves prey toward ground of its own choosing. "I'm not letting them decide where this ship goes," Elena said, and turned to her helm officer. "Full reverse thrust, then hard burn on my mark, straight through the gap between the 3rd and 4th ship. It's the widest angle they've left us. Captain, if we clip either of those hulls at that speed, then we won't clip them. Mark." The Meridian screamed backward, engines howling in protest, and for one heartbeat the formation around them didn't react at all, as if the possibility of prey choosing its own direction simply hadn't occurred to whatever coordinated them. Elena used that heartbeat. The ship punched forward through the gap at an angle no cautious pilot would have risked, hull groaning, alarms shrieking through every deck, and burst free into open space with barely 30 meters of clearance on either side. Behind them, the black ships began to turn, unhurried, certain, like something that had never once lost prey, and saw no reason to believe this time would be different. "Asteroid field bearing 214, the navigator called out. "Dense enough to break sensor lock if we're fast. Take us in." The Meridian threaded the field at a speed that made even Cale grip his console with all 4 hands. Rock and debris, flashing past the viewport close enough to see texture, and slowly, gradually, the pursuit fell back, unwilling or unable to match the reckless line Elena carved through the chaos. For the first time in almost an hour, the bridge exhaled. It was Amara, still catching her breath at the science station, who found what changed everything. "I'm picking up something in the noise," she said, pulling data off a passive sensor array that had been recording everything since they crossed the veil. A transmission. Old, layered under a dozen kinds of interference, like it's been broadcasting on repeat for a very long time, same as the beacon. She frowned at her screen, running the signal through translation matrices that spat back fragment after fragment of failure. Most of it doesn't match anything. Dead languages, extinct species, nothing my database can place. "Most of it," Elena repeated. "There's one piece that isn't dead." Amara's voice had gone strange, careful, the way it had when she'd first read the warning in the beacon's core chamber. "One piece is close enough to a known dialect that the system's flagging a partial match." "Which dialect?" Amara looked up from the screen and the color had drained from her face. "English," she said. "Old English, pre-coalition. It shouldn't exist out here, There's no reason a signal broadcasting for thousands of years should carry a fragment of a human dialect unless what? Unless it was meant for us. She swallowed hard. Elena, I ran the fragment through everything I have. It's not random. It's not noise that happens to sound like a name. It's addressed. Specifically. By name. Addressed to who? Amara turned the screen so Elena could see it herself. The translated string glowing pale against the dark readout. 3 words that made the recycled air on the bridge feel suddenly too thin to breathe. To Earth. Remember. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a long moment. Then the proximity alarm began to scream and the navigator's voice cracked through the silence. Captain, the field's not holding them off anymore. They found a way through. And Captain, there's something else. A signature just entered the field behind us. Bigger than all the others combined. It's not hurting this time, it's hunting. The Meridian died a little that day, though it took almost an hour for anyone to say so out loud. They lost the outer hull plating first, stripped away by a debris storm kicked up when the larger signature tore through the asteroid field behind them, without slowing, without caring what it destroyed to close the gap. Then they lost the secondary reactor. Overloaded from the strain of a burn, Elena pushed the engines past every rated limit to survive. By the time the ship finally broke free of the field and found cover in the radiation shadow of a dead moon, half the Meridian systems were running on backup power and everyone aboard understood they had bought minutes, not safety. They set down in the ruins of what had once been a settlement on the moon's surface, foundations only, walls long since collapsed, but enough structure to hide a ship's heat signature from anything still searching the field above. In the sudden quiet, Elena finally let herself ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since Amara read those 3 words off the screen. To Earth, remember. Remember what? She asked, standing over Amara's station while Kyle hovered nearby, arms folded, saying nothing, which by now had become its own kind of answer. Amara had spent the last 40 minutes pulling apart every fragment of data the passive sensors had recorded since they crossed the veil. Not just the transmission, but the beacon's activation pattern, the symbols, the genetic scan the ship's medical bay had automatically run on her after the chamber lit up beneath her hand. What she found made her go very still. I need you to understand I didn't go looking for this, she said quietly. The medbay scan flagged an anomaly in my genetic markers days ago, back before we even crossed the line. I assumed it was an equipment fault. I didn't have time to chase it down. She turned the screen so Elena could see. It's not a fault. It's a match. A partial genetic signature that lines up with pre-coalition human remains recovered from 3 separate dig sites. Sites that predate every accepted timeline for when humans left Earth's solar system. Sites that shouldn't have human remains in them at all. Kyle finally spoke, and his voice had none of its usual clipped formality left in it. I have known this for 6 years, Captain. Since before I was assigned to your crew. He looked at her, and there was something almost like shame behind his 4 dark eyes. It is buried in Coalition archives so deep that even senior liaison officers are only shown fragments on a need-to-know basis, and told never to repeat them. Humanity was not classified as a young species because you are young. You were classified that way because it was convenient to treat you as new. Convenient how? Elena's voice was low, dangerous. Because the alternative was admitting that your species did not originate on Earth at all. That Earth was a placement, a controlled reseeding of a population that existed before, one that was hunted nearly to extinction by something the elder species chose never to confront directly. Your ancestors' memories, their history, their technology, all of it was stripped away, deliberately. And what remained was set down quietly on a world far from the veil, to see whether the pattern would repeat if given time to forget. He exhaled, a long, tired sound. It has taken you 6 years to reach a boundary my people have avoided for 6,000. You did not do that by accident, Elena. You did it because something in you remembers a road you were never taught existed. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of failing backup power. You're telling me humanity is a science experiment, Elena said flatly. I am telling you humanity is a survivor, Kyle corrected, which the people who erased your history found far more useful to call an experiment. Before Elena could answer, the ship's proximity sensors, running on the barest trickle of power left, screamed a warning that cut through everything else. One of the hurting vessels had found their heat signature despite the radiation cover, breaking off from the search pattern above and dropping toward the ruins at a speed that left no time for a clean evacuation. "Everyone to the shuttle now," Elena ordered, already moving, hauling Amara up by the arm while Cale grabbed what salvage gear he could reach. They didn't all make it. Ensign Reyes Dumont, the ship's youngest tactical officer, 26 years old and 3 months into his first deep space posting, stayed behind at the emergency console to manually reroute what little power remained into the shuttle bay doors that had jammed under the strain of the earlier burn and would not open in time otherwise. Elena screamed at him over the comm to abandon the console and run. He didn't answer. He held the override steady with both hands as the ship's hull began to buckle under the approaching vessel's proximity field, and the doors ground open just wide enough, just long enough, for the shuttle to clear the bay before the console, and the section of hull around it, was torn away entirely. Elena watched it happen through the shuttle's rear viewport, unable to do anything but watch, and something in her chest broke in a way she knew wouldn't heal by the next mission, or the one after that. Nobody spoke for a long time after they cleared the debris field. It was Kyle, eventually, who broke the silence, his voice rough with something that might have been grief for a man he'd known less than a month. "He chose that," he said quietly. No order compelled it. He simply chose it in the last seconds he had without hesitation. He looked at Elena, and for the first time she saw something behind his composure that looked almost like understanding. "I begin to see why the ones who hunt you are so persistent, Captain. And I begin to fear I finally understand what they are afraid of losing." The shuttle's comm crackled to life before Elena could respond. A transmission bleeding through from the pursuing fleet, garbled at first, then resolving into words that stopped her cold. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't static. It was a voice, ancient and patient, running a query through the shuttle's own systems as though it already had the authority to do so, cross-referencing something against a database none of them had access to. And when it finished, a single line of text appeared on every screen aboard the shuttle at once, addressed to no one else in the fleeing crew but her. Genetic match confirmed. Designation: Elena Voss. Lineage: first bloodline. Retrieval priority: absolute. Elena stared at the words, her own name staring back at her from a database built by something that had been hunting her ancestors since long before Earth had a history to forget. "They're not looking for survivors anymore," she said quietly. "No," Cale agreed, watching the pursuing signatures close in on the sensor display, closer now than they had ever been. They found exactly who they were looking for. The message that reached the Coalition Assembly 3 days later wasn't supposed to exist at all. Kyle sent it himself, in violation of 6 separate protocols he could recite from memory, using a burst transmitter salvaged from the shuttle's wreck-adjacent debris field, and a launch window so narrow that even he gave it less than even odds of reaching anyone who mattered. It carried everything: the beacon, the warning, the fleet, the genetic match, the words "first bloodline" repeated in a database older than every species currently arguing about humanity's manners at diplomatic functions. He didn't send it to ask for rescue. He sent it because he had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of the last 3 days, that a lie 6,000 years old had already cost enough people their lives without his silence adding to the debt. The response came back encrypted, urgent and utterly predictable to anyone who understood how frightened institutions behave when their oldest secret starts leaking. It wasn't a rescue order. It was a kill order. Quiet, deniable, routed through channels that would never trace back to an official decision. The Meridian's surviving crew, along with any evidence they carried, was to be treated as a containment breach. Nothing more. "They'd rather erase us than explain us," Elena said, reading the intercepted directive off Amara's makeshift console in the cramped hold of a salvaged transport they'd scavenged from the ruins. Barely spaceworthy, barely armed, barely enough to hold the 11 of them who remained. 6,000 years of hiding this, And their answer is still the same one. Bury it. It is the answer every frightened power gives, Kale said. I am no longer certain it is mine. That admission cost him something visible, a stiffness in his posture that eased slightly, as though he'd been carrying an old weight and finally set part of it down. He had spent 6 years believing his species' caution was wisdom. He was beginning to understand it had simply been fear wearing wisdom's clothes. Amara, meanwhile, hadn't stopped working since the crash. She'd found something in the ruins near their hiding spot before they fled. An underground chamber sealed beneath the settlement's foundations, protected by the same interlocking symbols from the beacon, but older, rougher, hand-carved rather than engineered. Human adjacent. Not coalition. Not elder. Something that predated both. This wasn't left by whoever built the beacon, she said, running her hands over a wall that lit, faint and reluctant at her touch. The same reaction the beacon's chamber had shown, but weaker, like a dying battery answering a familiar signal. This was left by refugees, people running from the same thing that's hunting us now, who stopped here long enough to bury something and leave a marker so whoever came looking would know they weren't the first. What they found beneath the chamber floor wasn't weapons, and it wasn't information. It was seed technology, compact, dormant, unmistakably human in its design language despite being older than every archive Earth had ever produced, built to interface with exactly the kind of genetic marker Amara and Elena both carried in their blood. It's not a weapon, Amara said, awe cutting through her exhaustion. It's a key. To what? I don't know yet. But it was made for us, specifically us. Our ancestors left tools behind for descendants they hoped would eventually come looking. Elena stared at the dormant device, feeling the weight of an inheritance she'd never asked for and couldn't refuse. Can you activate it? I think I already am, slowly. It's been reading my genetic signature since the moment I touched it. That night, if the word still meant anything on a moon with no true day, Elena gathered what remained of her crew in the transport's cramped hold, human and alien alike, and said the thing she'd been circling for 3 days without letting herself land on it. We can't outrun what's coming. Not in this ship, not with what we have left. Every plan I've run ends the same way. We go dark, we hide, and eventually they find us. Because they have never once failed to find what they're hunting. She looked around at their faces, worn and frightened, and still somehow watching her like they hadn't given up yet. So I think we stop running. Toward what exactly? Asked the ship's remaining tactical officer, voice flat with exhaustion. Toward whatever the seed technology is trying to become, toward whatever our ancestors left behind for exactly this moment. Elena's voice steadied as she spoke, the plan forming in real time, built on nothing but instinct and the stubborn conviction that had gotten her exiled from a dozen safe decisions before this one. Every species in this coalition has spent 6 years telling humanity what we are. Reckless, young, dangerous in ways nobody can quite define. Maybe they were right about the danger. Maybe they were just wrong about why. Kale watched her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not skepticism, not caution, but something closer to recognition. You intend to become what your ancestors were. I intend to stop apologizing for being their descendant. It was Kale, in the end, who made the choice that mattered most. He stood formally in front of the crew, human and the handful of remaining aliens both, and made a declaration that would end his career, his standing, possibly his life, the moment his own species learned of it. I withdraw as observer, he said. I no longer serve as the coalition's eyes aboard this vessel. Whatever comes next, I choose to stand with this crew, not report on it. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something in the hold shifted. A held breath finally released, as the crew went to work bringing the seed technology fully online with what little power the transport had left to spare. The device woke slowly, then all at once, light climbing through channels that had lain dormant for millennia, systems humming to life in configurations that felt, impossibly, familiar, as though some instinct buried deeper than memory recognized the shape of what it was seeing. Amara worked the interface with hands that moved faster than her conscious mind seemed to be directing them, pulling up schematics, power routing, a technology base that made the Meridian's own systems look primitive by comparison. The surge, when it came, was massive. Power flooding through the buried chamber and up into the transport's own systems, overloading every sensor at once in a spike bright enough to be seen from orbit. Which was exactly when the hunting fleet's flagship found them. It didn't creep up. It didn't herd. It simply decloaked directly above the ruins, close enough that its shadow swallowed the entire settlement. A ship larger than anything they had yet seen, ancient beyond even the beacon's age, radiating a kind of stillness that felt less like a machine powering down and more like something old and patient, finally deciding it no longer needed to hide. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then every screen in the transport lit with the same signal at once, and this time, it wasn't a database query. It wasn't a designation confirmation. It was a voice, corrupted, ancient, dragging itself through what remained of a language none of them had ever heard spoken aloud, and yet every human aboard understood it instantly, the way you understand your own name spoken by someone in the dark. "I have been waiting a very long time," it said, "to speak to someone who still remembers." The voice didn't sound like a monster. That was the first thing Elena noticed, standing in the trembling hold of a dying transport beneath the shadow of a ship large enough to blot out the sky, and it frightened her more than anything else had in 3 days of running. Monsters were easy. This voice sounded tired. "I have been waiting a very long time," it said again, "to speak to someone who still remembers." Remembers what? Elena kept her own voice steady, though every instinct told her to run and there was nowhere left to run to. "Who are you?" A pause long enough that Amara wondered if the connection had failed. Then the answer came, and it changed the shape of everything they thought they understood. "I was born the same year your first ancestor was. We were not enemies then. We were brothers." The flagship's hull began to shift, panels folding back with the slow deliberateness of something that had all the time in the universe and no longer feared using it, revealing not weapons, not boarding craft, but a single chamber lit from within, an observation deck, built unmistakably in a style that echoed the seed technology buried beneath their feet. Ancient, human-adjacent, familiar in a way that made the hair rise on Elena's arms. Before the coalition, before the veil, there was one people spread across 100 worlds, and we broke ourselves apart over a war so old that even I no longer remember which side started it, only that it never truly ended. I have spent 6,000 years finishing a fight the rest of my people forgot, because forgetting was easier than admitting it was never worth fighting. The voice dragged, weary, ancient beyond patience. Your ancestors fled. Mine stayed, and hunted, because a war without an ending needs an excuse to keep breathing. You are the last bloodline of the ones who ran. I am what remains of the ones who never stopped chasing them. Cal stepped forward, 4 eyes fixed on the observation deck above them. You are not a fleet. You are a remnant. Everything you command. It isn't conquest. It's the last habit of a war that should have died with the people who started it. Habits are difficult to break when they are the only thing left holding you together, the voice answered. And for the first time, something in it cracked. Not weakness, but grief, ancient and unresolved. I do not know how to be anything else. I have chased the memory of my brothers across the dark for longer than your entire species has existed, and now, finally, one of you stands close enough to end it. Elena understood in that moment exactly what was being offered to her, and exactly what it would cost. You could kill us, she said quietly. Right now. Easily. You've had the power to do it since the moment you found us. I could. I have killed every bloodline that crossed the veil before yours. It changes nothing, it never has. There is always another beacon. Always another descendant who forgets enough to wander back. A pause. I am tired, First Bloodline. I did not survive this long to keep winning a war with no purpose left in it. I survived because no one ever offered me a reason to stop. Behind her, Elena felt the crew's collective breath held tight, human and Thakari alike, waiting on a decision only she could make. She thought of Reyes Dumont holding a jammed door open with his bare hands so the rest of them could live. She thought of 6,000 years of hidden history, buried not out of cruelty but fear, the same fear this ancient, exhausted thing had been drowning in since before Earth had a name. She thought about what it meant to be the descendant of people who ran, and what it might mean, finally, to be the ones who stopped running and turned to face what had been chasing them all along, not with a weapon, but with an answer. "I'm not here to keep fighting your war," she said. "I never agreed to it. Neither did anyone on this ship, human or otherwise. You've spent 6,000 years finishing something that isn't yours to finish anymore, because the people who started it are gone, and the people who inherited it never asked for it." She stepped closer to the viewport, close enough that the ancient ship's light fell fully across her face. "I'm offering you what nobody's ever offered you before. Not a surrender. Not a victory. An ending. A real one. Not because you lost, but because it's finally allowed to be over." Silence stretched long enough that Amara reached for Elena's hand without thinking, bracing for whatever came next. "You cannot end a war by asking it to stop," the voice said. But there was less certainty in it now than there had been in anything else it had spoken. "No," Elena agreed. "But I can end it by refusing to keep it alive. That's the only power I actually have. And it turns out that's the one thing your side never counted on. Someone on the other end who simply says no and means it and doesn't flinch when you don't like the answer." The flagship went very still. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing moved. Not the fleet, not the transport, not even the light drifting through the ruined settlement below. Elena stood in that silence and did not look away, because looking away, she understood with sudden clarity, was the one thing that had let this war outlive everyone who remembered why it began. Then, slowly, the black ships surrounding them began to power down. Not disabled. Not defeated. Simply stopped, the way a held breath finally releases, weapons systems going dark one vessel at a time, until the entire fleet hung motionless in the wreckage-strewn dark, silent for the first time in longer than any living record could measure. "It has been a very long time," the voice said, quieter now, almost gentle, "since anyone gave me permission to rest." The transmission ended. The flagship did not attack. It simply drifted, dark and still, and stayed that way. The Coalition Assembly received the full recording 9 days later, delivered not through official channels, but broadcast openly across every public relay Kale could reach before anyone could intercept it. Proof, finally, too public to bury. What followed wasn't graceful. There were denials, investigations, furious closed-door sessions that Elena was never invited to and didn't care to attend. But the truth, once loose, refused to be put back in its box. The elder species who had buried humanity's history for 6,000 years were forced for the first time to answer for it in front of everyone they had spent that history trying to reassure. Humanity's classification changed within the month, not to something flattering, to something true. Descendants of a pre-coalition civilization, first bloodline lineage, status, independent, and sovereign. No longer young, no longer reckless children to be managed, simply people who had been lied to for longer than they'd been allowed to know it, and who had, in the end, ended a war that had outlived everyone who remembered starting it. Elena stood months later at the very edge of what had once been the Veil Line, now marked not as a forbidden boundary but as an open gate, watching the first wave of human exploration vessels cross freely for the first time in the species' recorded history. Kale stood beside her, no longer an observer, no longer answering to anyone but the crew he'd chosen. Amara stood on her other side, still running data from the seed technology through her console, still chasing the next mystery, because some things about a person never really change. "They're not afraid of us anymore," Kyle said. "They're afraid of what we might become." "Good," Elena said. "Let them wonder." Amara looked up from her screen, watching the new ships pass through the open line one after another, human hands finally reaching toward a history that had been waiting patiently in the dark for someone to come looking. "We were never the newest people in this galaxy," she said quietly, more to herself than to either of them. "We were just the ones who forgot the longest." She smiled, small and tired and real, as the last ship crossed the threshold behind them. "And we remembered just in time."